Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest, Ellen Carrillo, has written a new book from the Modern Language Association called The MLA Guide to Digital Literacy. The book addresses a chronic issue with web-based digital content: how to gauge credibility, authority, and bias of digital sources. The issues here aren't new. Ever since we started publishing to the web, there have been tactics for verifying content credibility. But over the years, the sheer volume of content published to the web, along with rapidly changing technology, the introduction of the social web, and the many ways people are gaming the system, are causing information professionals to perpetually adjust their strategies for tracking and evaluating digital content marketplace. It's not hyperbole to say, indeed many are already saying so, that the amount of disinformation, bias, and other kinds of manipulated digital content on the web are serious threats to our democracy. And that very issue plays a key role behind the scenes in Ellen Carrillo's book, where it's ever more important for students to understand what digital literacy is and the skills necessary to achieve it, not only for their post-secondary research, but to remain informed citizens. In this second episode of our four-part series, Ellen, who is Associate Professor and Writing Coordinator at the University of Connecticut, talks about how digital aptitude, especially with digital natives, does not equate to digital literacy, and where we're at in terms of making digital literacy a core part of our education. I'm wondering if you've had time to see how these principles or, just your own instruction have panned out in sort of a longer term kind of perspective with the students, are in terms of the sort of surrounding work that they have to do in remaining digitally literate. Do these sorts of principles and or practices embed themselves into the students' research life eventually, or is it something people constantly have to work at?
I would hope that they would embed themselves into students' sort of research lives, although I
Yeah.
haven't done any longitudinal studies or anything to track that quite yet,
Hmm.
although perhaps down the line. But I would say that I do think it's important that students have more opportunities than, let's say, just in one class, perhaps in first year writing or a first year seminar,
Yeah.
to do this work. I think it needs to be something that is really part of the curriculum in all disciplines. And so it is something that becomes really just a habit for students throughout their academic careers. And I think the best way to do that is to make a space for it across the curriculum in all disciplines rather than focusing just in one course. Otherwise, I think students won't understand the importance of it and how it applies to all majors, all disciplines, and really their lives as citizens as well.
Yeah. Do you see that happening, for example, at UConn or anywhere else, where digital literacy practices are kind of spreading out into other disciplines?
Unfortunately, not quite yet. I
Yeah.
think I think we've frankly waited too long to realize we need to do this.
Yeah.
And so now we're sort of in scrambling mode
Mhm.
where we're figuring out ways to do so.
Right.
And I'm working on that too as the writing coordinator at the Waterbury campus of UConn. I do reach out to faculty across the disciplines and I hold workshops and so forth on this. But it's slow going.
Yeah.
It's just started. And honestly, and understandably, faculty members have certain content that they feel as though they need to cover, and they certainly do. And so we're trying to figure out the best ways to integrate this into courses while not taking away from the content that faculty also need to cover according to their disciplines and so forth.
Right. Right. Okay. So students these days have obviously grown up in a digital information era. They're adept at using and navigating apps on the web, but we clearly can't assume that they also know which information is or source is credible and which isn't. Just because they grew up with the web, we can't assume they know, for example, the difference between Breitbart and the Times, or even the Wall Street Journal and the Times. Do we too often conflate digital aptitude with digital literacy? And if so, why do you think we do that? And I suppose, is there a way to sort of avoid that?
Sure. So I do think that we conflate digital aptitude with digital literacy. And
Yeah.
I would go as far as to say that that's one of the main reasons we didn't address digital literacy sooner.
Hmm.
It took educators very long, I think, to realize that just because students are really adept at posting on social media and navigating apps does not mean they are adept at all things digital. For more than a decade, research has shown that students have trouble assessing the biases of sources, judging whether something is a sponsored ad or a news story, judging the credibility of sources, locating primary documents, using hyperlinks to look more closely into a subject. And of course, more research has come out since the 2016 presidential election, but there was a decent amount of research along these lines prior to that election. But the gap in students' abilities didn't really register as all that important until the 2016 presidential election. And I think that's because the stakes just got really high. We all realized that our democracy was and is at stake. The antidote, I would say, is increased attention to the problem. So this means teaching students what they need to know. And this
Hmm.
includes how to locate bias, how to judge credibility, how to find primary documents, and also teaching them how to read digital text as digital text by capitalizing on hyperlinks and the web-like features of the web that can help them dive pretty deeply into any issue or subject.
Right. So, you sort of talked about this timeline that's suddenly been, I guess compressed in a way that after the 2016 election, and I wanted to dive a little bit more into what it means for society that we're only now making, in a big way, making digital literacy a part of our educational system. And you note that to be educated is to be digitally literate. Baby boomers, for example, may not, at least in today's terms, be properly educated in that sense. I mean, I suppose I could even be left out given my age, which I won't disclose. But these programs, and/or concepts were not available to me when I was in college, and yet I feel like I'm pretty digitally literate. And I'm wondering, does one have to have coursework in digital literacy to be educated? Are there other ways to become educated about digital literacy? And if so, I'm wondering if you can share some examples.
Sure. So I don't know that one needs coursework per se to be
Yeah.
considered digitally literate, but one does need to be aware of certain aspects of the digital landscape. That can be done on your own by reading up on algorithms, filters, and deep fake videos, or what are also called deep fakes. And these are aspects of digital literacy that the MLA guide addresses. And the guide is really for anyone who wants to learn about all of this. And I think it would be accessible to baby boomers and others.
Hmm.
Librarians, too, at local libraries often organize and lead discussions that address digital literacy. So that's another way that folks can get educated. I do think that this kind of education is important no matter where someone gets it. The digital landscape is becoming more sophisticated, and even really smart people get duped. And so it's important to do what you can to educate yourself about how all of this works so that you do have some tools to help you determine what you can and can't trust.
Right. So back in the day, there were plenty of naysayers who predicted the collapse of authority online. I'm wondering if you think whether they were right. I mean, I guess given that you've written this book, I think you'd say no. But should we at least have been teaching these concepts decades ago? And it seems like it's taken us an awfully long time to make digital literacy skills a core part of an education. Was it simply the information landscape was simpler back then?
So I agree. I think it has taken us too long to make digital literacy skills a core part of an education. But I think initially we were all just really excited about how the web was reflecting democracy.
Hmm.
Of course, not everyone had a voice. There have always been issues of access, and I think unfortunately there will always be. But the web created a space that allowed for many people to share their ideas and opinions. People worked together on various wiki sites, and the possibilities to collaborate and to learn from each other really seemed endless. And so I would say that this, along with our assumptions about students' technological abilities, got in the way of our recognizing the need to really incorporate digital literacy into our curricula when we should have. But in some ways, the information landscape was simpler, at least in terms of content and speed. In recent years, the volume of information has increased, as has the speed at which information is made available. We no longer even need to look things up via Google, for example. Algorithms decide what they think we want to know about, and they send that information directly to us. We are notified with a ping from our phone. And beyond volume and speed, websites and platforms are becoming so much more sophisticated. There was a time when you could tell a homemade website from a mile away. It had typos and an odd layout, and you knew that you probably couldn't trust what was on that site. And that's simply no longer the case. The capacity to create a professional looking website is at everyone's fingertips. Many years ago, there was also a clearer distinction between .org and .com sites. Students were often told that .org sites, sites with no commercial backing, were likely more trustworthy. That's no longer the case, and that hasn't been for a while. And now we are even seeing commercial enterprises and other groups purposely using the .org domain because it still carries with it that sense of credibility. So yes, ultimately we are faced with a much more complicated information landscape.
You just heard from Ellen Carrillo, author of a new book published by the MLA called The MLA Guide to Digital Literacy. Ellen is Associate Professor and Writing Coordinator at the University of Connecticut. Join us next week when Ellen and I continue our conversation and discuss how the checklist approach to verifying online content doesn't go quite far enough, why it's important to remember the media is not the enemy, and whether fake news is a content problem, a technology problem, or both. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's digital media specialist, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.